Okay. And I'm also going to, in a moment, enable the live transcript function here for accessibility purposes. So as an AI transcription, it's a little bit wonky, but it should give a general gist. And it's just kind of nice to have the text along with the sound. So welcome, everyone. We are so happy to have you with us. We're here to hear from Petre about her new book, All of the News That's Fit to Click: How Metrics Are Transforming the Work of Journalists, published by Princeton University Press just over a month ago. Let me introduce myself and the discussants, and then I'll proceed to properly introducing Caitlin and her book. So I'm Melissa Aronchik. I'm one of the organizers of the Digital Ethnography Working Group at Rutgers University, which is one of the hosts of today's event. The other organizer and co-founder, also one of our discussants today, is Jeff Lane. We're both associate professors in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University in New Jersey. The Rutgers Digital Ethnography Working Group is in its second year. We are really excited to be working together and supporting active digital ethnographers and researchers within the Rutgers School of Communication and Information and beyond. We have some graduates who have moved on to other places and to us. We have regular workshops and writing groups. So I'm just going to mute. We have a series of events, and we have a lot of plans in the works for future collaborations, including an upcoming proposal to the International Communication Association in Paris next spring, as well as some events hopefully in the summer. So please do, in the moment, I'll put into the chat our website and our Twitter handle. So please do join our mailing list to find out more about all the events that are taking place at Duke. Today's event is co-sponsored with the Stanford Ethnography Lab at Stanford University, which also supports ethnographic and fieldwork research through a variety of initiatives, including graduate fellowships, workshops, seminars, and collaborative opportunities. So let me quickly introduce our discussants. I already mentioned Jeff Lane, Associate Professor of Communication at Rutgers University. Jeff is the author of The Digital Street, out from Oxford University Press, which is a neighborhood study of social media use in Harlem, New York City. And his research includes social media as evidence in criminal court, the role of gender in school discipline, and a visual study of perceptions of Harlem. Our other discussant today is Angèle Christine, who's an assistant professor of communication and an appointment in sociology at Stanford University. Angèle is the author of Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms from Princeton University Press, which we had the incredible chance of hosting Angèle last year in our Duke workshop, which was fantastic. Angèle's book focuses on the case of web journalism, analyzing the growing importance of audience data in web newsrooms in the US and France. All right, now let me move to introducing the author and the book we'll be discussing today. Petre is an assistant professor in the School of Communication and Information, and we are really delighted to welcome you, Caitlin, to this space to talk with us about your book, All the News That's Fit to Click. The book is a behind-the-scenes look. Sorry, got an echo going there. The book is a behind-the-scenes look at how performance analytics are transforming the work of journalism. She shows how digital metrics are a powerful but insidious new form of managerial surveillance.
Well, that's because I've got my phone on and I'm leaving.
Hang on one second. I'm going to do some muting here. There we go. Sorry. So to come back, Caitlin's book shows how digital metrics are a powerful but insidious new form of managerial surveillance and discipline, but how this new metrics universe can also work to empower journalists who can then use the metrics to advocate for their professional worth and autonomy. Without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Caitlin, Jeff, and Angèle. And thanks again, everyone, for being here. We're really happy to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So the plan is that I'm going to talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, probably around 25 is the goal. And then we'll move to having questions from Jeff and Angèle, and then open it up to all of you. So I'm going to share my screen now. Bear with me for a moment so that you can see. Oops. All right, how does that look? You see the slide? Okay, good. And can you hear me? Okay, good. Great. All right. All right. Okay. Okay, so thank you all again for being here today. This is the first event I've done for this book, and I just couldn't be happier about being able to do it with Duke and with the Stanford Ethnography Lab and some of my favorite scholars and people. So thank you so much to Melissa and Jeff and Angèle and Forrest for making this happen, and for Holly for all of the work that you've also done to make this happen. It's just really such a pleasure. All right. So I'm going to start with a story that opens the book. And this is that in early 2011, the site Business Insider published a leaked internal slide deck that was called the AOL Way. So this was a slide deck that was supposed to be internal at AOL, but somebody leaked it and sent it to Business Insider, and Business Insider publishes it. And around this time this is leaked, AOL has recently gotten a new CEO, a guy named Tim Armstrong, and he come right from Google, right into running AOL. And so the AOL Way, this slide deck, was sort of seen as Armstrong's vision for how to make AOL into a successful digital media company. AOL at this point owns kind of dozens of media properties, but is flailing in the business. And so the AOL Way was supposed to be this kind of new strategic direction for journalism at AOL. And what became immediately clear, looking at this 58-slide PowerPoint, the AOL Way, was that Armstrong viewed journalism as a type of labor that could be almost completely rationalized and standardized. So here's a slide from the AOL Way that walks writers and editors there who are being trained on the AOL Way via this PowerPoint, walking them through what was called the content generation process. The rest of us might call it journalism, but they called it the content generation process. And the content generation process in the AOL Way was broken up into a 7-step flowchart. And each of these steps then had their own slides in the deck that were showing journalists exactly what they were supposed to do in their capacity as journalists at an AOL media property. So here's a pretty indicative slide. This is showing journalists that they're supposed to, step 1, identify high demand topics. So editors and writers are instructed to use an algorithm called the Blogsmith Demand Assignment Tool to identify in-demand topics to write about. And then they're supposed to, if you can see the little red box that I made there, they're supposed to use editorial judgment and insight to determine production. For example, if Macaulay Culkin and Mila Kunis are trending because they broke up, arrow, write story about Macaulay Culkin and Mila Kunis. Now, journalism scholars and journalists themselves have a lot of debates and a lot of arguments about kind of what constitutes editorial judgment, what constitutes editorial insight. But I think it's fair to say that most of us would think that this probably does not fall under our definition. But at AOL, in the AOL Way, this was what editorial judgment became, right? It became a kind of series of systematized and rationalized decisions. And so the AOL Way, this PowerPoint, was received with a mixture of astonishment and derision and abject horror in journalism circles. There was a writer for the website TechCrunch that called the document a 58-page death warrant for journalists and the practice of journalism at AOL. Now, to these journalists, the AOL Way really represented a new and very frightening type of managerial interference into editorial work, right? But in advocating for this kind of relentlessly metrics-driven content optimization, AOL is in fact taking a page out of a century-old managerial playbook, Taylorism, and revamping it for journalism in the digital age. So for those who are not familiar, in 1911, so this is exactly a century before the leak of the AOL Way, a mechanical engineer named Frederick Winslow Taylor published a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. And Taylor argued that if managers wanted to make factory work more efficient, they needed to pay closer attention to the labor process. That is the way that work is organized, the way that work is carried out, down to the smallest detail. So scientific management becomes associated with time studies in which managers break down a particular work task like loading big pieces of iron into a railway car, you break down the task into its kind of smallest component micro tasks. You figure out how to optimize and streamline each of those, and then you make sure that all workers carry out the tasks exactly to the specifications set by management, right? So when a manager rationalizes the labor process in this kind of scientific management vein, the manager is doing two things, right? First, it's assumed that they make the work more efficient and therefore they make it more profitable. And second, by standardizing the way that each micro task must be done, the manager is kind of de-skilling the worker, right? Because the high level thinking and planning and conception of the labor process is left to the manager, and the worker is merely kind of executing their assigned steps. So scientific management kind of takes root in industrial production. And then as the 20th century progresses, these approaches migrate into clerical work and retail work and service work. And throughout all this, there's sort of one group of workers that stays relatively insulated from these kinds of scientific management techniques. And that's a group of workers that we might think of as knowledge workers and creative workers, right? There's a lot of debate in the literature about the terms knowledge work. These are sort of contested concepts, which I write about a lot in the book. But for now, we'll go with a working definition of knowledge workers as those whose work centers on the production, communication, and circulation of knowledge and cultural products. So journalists fall under that. So knowledge workers and creative workers have been kind of relatively insulated from this kind of scientific management, but that starts to change now for several reasons. And one of the reasons is that there's this rise of digital network technologies and algorithms that afford the opportunity to quantitatively evaluate and track and evaluate these types of work on a much more kind of granular level, right? So decisions about, which potholes should be filled in cities, or which drugs a physician should prescribe, or which movie scripts should be greenlit, or which employees should be hired and fired. These kinds of decisions are now kind of increasingly drawing on quantitative data analytics and algorithms. And headlines like the ones I have up on this slide tend to elicit kind of one of two responses. So there's the optimistic response, which is, these tools are good. They augment human decision-making. They help overcome, certain human biases, right, that people may not be aware of. So they're good. And then there's the pessimistic response, which is that these tools are kind of systematically disempowering experts in a way that's really troubling, right? And automating things that shouldn't be automated with bad results. But like good ethnographers and in the vein of wonderful ethnographic scholars like Angèle and like Jeff, we know that we can't simply look at a new form of technology and know what impact it's going to have, right? We need to examine the making and the take-up of these technologies in situ. And so that's what I set out to do in this book. So when I teach methods, I always tell my students to start with kind of the most expansive, ambitious, perhaps fanciful version of their question, and then whittle down their ambitions from there. So I'm going to share with you the most ambitious, fanciful version of my own question in this book, which is, how are metrics produced, interpreted, and put to use in the knowledge workplace? And with what implications for the way that knowledge work is organized and managed? And the book answers this question via a close look at the role of audience metrics in digital US journalism. Now, journalism is a really interesting case to look at these kinds of questions of metrics and the labor process in knowledge work. Journalism is kind of facing a bunch of challenges right now, right? So many of which will probably be familiar to many of you, but I'll run through a couple of them quickly. So, first we have kind of structural economic challenges. There's been ongoing in the US media deregulation for the past several decades, which has led to kind of unprecedented corporate consolidation and the formation of these sort of media mega conglomerates that have been largely rubber stamped by the FCC, basically. And that's led to a greater and greater sort of commercialism of the news media. There's also in recent years been kind of the platformization of news. So that is when news organizations become increasingly dependent on big tech platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter and so on for the distribution of their content online, right? And then also these companies, namely Facebook and Google, are kind of gobbling up more and more and more of the online ad revenue that's available. So ad revenue that kind of previously might have gone to news organizations now goes to Facebook and Facebook and Google, which then kind of puts even more onus on the news organizations to depend on Facebook and Google for distribution. And then journalism is also facing really serious cultural and political challenges, right? So there's been a growing public distrust in the US context among the public. against journalists and news media. And this was in place even before Trump. So in the kind of decade before the 2016 election, you see that public trust in news media kind of drop precipitously in polls, along with many institutions. It's not just journalism, but journalism kind of takes one of the worst hits in terms of the drop in public trust, right? And so this also seems to indicate that there would be growing pressure to incorporate metrics into journalistic practice and journalistic work, because we know from historians of quantification like Theodore Porter that when a profession faces kind of public backlash, public distrust, that's a time when number-driven decision-making tends to come to the fore and push out more kind of discretion-driven decision-making. And then in the midst of these challenges that journalism is facing, we see that journalism has also seen this explosion in the ability to track audiences' behavior and responses to news content via data analytics tools, right? So platforms, I've taken screenshots of several of them here, platforms like Google Analytics, Chartbeat, Parsley, QuantCast, and many other companies measure in a very, very granular way how each and every online reader is interacting and engaging with news content, right? So these platforms are showing in real time often how many readers are clicking on a story, how many readers are sharing it on a social media platform, how many seconds on average readers are actually reading a story before they get bored and click on something else, and even where on the page they tend to drop off, right? How far down they scroll. So we've got this explosion of data in the midst of a really challenging environment for journalism as a field. So all of these signs kind of point to, or might predict, a rationalization of the journalism labor process that is technologically facilitated by metrics. But here's where things get kind of sticky and interesting, because at the same time, journalists, like many knowledge and creative workers, have an expectation of autonomy and relatively minimal managerial influence in their interference and influence in their labor process, right? And in the case of journalism, because it's such a public-facing profession, and especially in the age of social media, they also have this very visible public platform from which they can complain if they are dissatisfied about something. So journalism becomes a really fascinating case to examine this broader issue of the influx of analytics in knowledge work, because you have these two countervailing forces, right? You have on the one side these kind of political and cultural and economic pressures, and then on the other side you have journalists' expectation that their labor process will remain relatively autonomous from managerial interference. And so ethnographic work allows me to see kind of how this tension is playing out on the ground. So first, I want to see how analytics were produced. So I went to Chartbeat. And before I get into methods and research design, I should say I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this in depth because we have limited time. But I know a lot of folks are ethnography folks. So if you want to hear more about methods or research design stuff, I would be happy to talk about the nitty gritty of that in the Q&A for hours if you want. But first, I wanted to see how analytics were produced. And so I went to Chartbeat. And Chartbeat is a prominent tech startup that really was the first company to specialize in creating real-time web analytics specifically for journalists to use in the newsroom, right? So this is not something like Google Analytics that started out in an e-commerce context and then is kind of transported into the newsroom. Chartbeat comes along and says, no, we made a tool for you, for journalists to use in the newsroom. And that turns out to be very important. So I go to Chartbeat. And Chartbeat kind of has become, since they were founded in 2000, I believe it was 2009, they've become kind of extremely prominent in news organizations. They're now sort of ubiquitous and used by over 50,000 media sites in more than 60 countries. So really, if you go into a newsroom nowadays, a digital newsroom, you're likely to see a Chartbeat dashboard somewhere in that newsroom. And I got to spend 6 months doing ethnographic research at Chartbeat. I was observing internal meetings and product testing sessions and sales pitches and client trainings, and then also conducting interviews with staff members from sort of all different parts of the company there as well. And I didn't want to just see Chartbeat, though. I wanted to also understand how Chartbeat's tools were interpreted and used in distinct organizational contexts. And so I sort of followed Chartbeat's analytics tool into the newsrooms of two of its best known clients. So I knew I wanted to go to a site that was sort of a legacy publication that had maybe a long print history, was trying to make the transition into digital first mode of publishing. And so I did interviews at the New York Times with staffers at all kind of editorial levels of that organization. So this was interviews with reporters, editors, web producers, columnists, data analysts, strategists, And I really wanted to make sure that I got to see sort of an organization like the Times that kind of saw itself as the apex of journalistic prestige and professionalism and autonomy. And all of a sudden they've got a tool like Chartbeat. And so what do they do with it, right? And then I wanted to go to an organization that was very different from the New York Times. And so I went to Gawker Media, which at the time of my research was an independently owned network of blogs that had, its blogs covered a variety of topics from feminism to car culture, to video games, to politics, to celebrity gossip. It really kind of ran the gamut. And Gawker was known as this sort of scrappy, like digital upstart that took great glee in slaughtering some of the sacred cows of traditional journalism, that was held very highly at the New York Times and places like that. And one of the things it was best known for as a company was that they were going to kind of unabashedly use metrics. They believed in really integrating metrics fully into the editorial decision-making process. So this was very interesting to me because the Gawker and the New York Times are very, very different organizations, but they both subscribe to the same analytics tool, right? They both have Chartbeat subscriptions. And so this made for a research design that provided me some nice variation. So I did all this, and what did I find there? For the rest of this talk, I'm going to lay out sort of the main argument of the book, which has kind of 4 major points. And I'm not going to go into depth on each of these points, but I'll talk through them in turn very briefly, just to give you all sort of a flavor of what is in the book. So first, I argue that metrics tools enable management to surveil, discipline, and extract increased productivity from journalists, right? So metrics tools like Chartbeat are able to do this effectively because they're designed intentionally and specifically in such a way that journalists get sort of hooked on using them. So if you ask a journalist about their relationship to Chartbeat, or at least when I did this became sort of a joke with myself and my research, because every time I ask this question, like, what do you think of, or what do you feel when I say Chartbeat? They would always say addicted, or it's addictive, right? They often spoke in terms of addiction. So this is a headline from when Chartbeat had a brief outage and was unavailable for like probably half a day in 2011. And there were literal articles written about it because journalists were so stressed out not to be able to see Chartbeat, right? So they developed these habits around using Chartbeat. And I was trying to figure out like what made Chartbeat so strongly habit forming. What was it about this tool that made journalists sort of feel that they were addicted to it? And so to figure this out, I started looking into the literature on game design. And it became clear that, specifically digital game design, it became clear that Chartbeat incorporates many of the same features that make digital games engaging and habit forming, right? So it has this kind of dynamic visual display. So what you're seeing here is Chartbeat's main dashboard. And this is a screenshot, so it's actually not dynamic at all. It's static, but if you were actually looking at the dashboard, you would be seeing, this top pages list, those stories would be shuffling as people kind of go to these stories and leave them in their browsers, right? And then in the upper left-hand corner here, where you see concurrence, that's a measure of the number of people that are currently reading an article on the site that's being measured. That number would be kind of constantly rising and falling. And this little needle here on this speedometer-like dial would be sort of quivering. And I found myself, as I look at this tool, like you can't look away. It's very compelling. It's very sort of mesmerizing. So it has this dynamic visual display. And because it's a real-time tool rather than a series of static reports, like this was your traffic for yesterday, this was your traffic for 1 p.m. to 2 p.m., because it's not static reports and it's a real-time tool, it also has this quality of endlessness, right? Where people would report a sort of feeling of FOMO or fear of missing out if they turned away from it, if they stopped looking at it because they thought they would miss something important in the data. And then finally, like many of the kind of most compelling games, the chase for traffic, if you're a journalist, has this really addictive mix of chance and skill, right? So in some sense, journalists had a feeling that they could control what got traffic. They had a sense sort of for the types of things and the time to post things and how to kind of optimize their performance. But there was also this huge element of chance that they could never control. And the combination of those two things of agency, but also contingency, turned out to be very strongly habit forming. And so what all this means is that journalists who used Chartbeat became kind of these exhausted, but very determined and dogged players in what I call in the book, the traffic game. So they became fixated on trying to boost their numbers. And in so doing, they pushed themselves to work harder and harder and harder, right? And so here we see how the Chartbeat UX, which is an abbreviation of user experience, experience of using the product, how the Chartbeat UX extracts increased productivity, right? And here's a quote from a Gawker writer named Eddie. He says, Chartbeat is rough because it's relentless. There's never going to be a time when you can close your MacBook and be like, Chartbeat's all set, our traffic's good, we're ready to go, right? Like, that's amazing. You never feel like you can close your MacBook, right? What an effective tool of labor discipline that is. He says you can always do something else or post something else to Facebook to see if it sticks, or try tweeting a story again to see if maybe it'll get pick up now instead of this morning, right? So writers like Eddie are pushing themselves to work harder and harder, engaging in this labor of editorial optimization that never really ends, right? But here's the crucial thing, which is that they don't perceive this extracted productivity as something that their managers are forcing them to do, right? Even though, they may be responding to traffic targets that in Gawker's case were set by management, even though management is the one that brings in the Chartbeat subscription, they don't perceive it as something that management is forcing them to do to play this game. Because Chartbeat's user interface is designed to form a connection, a strong emotional connection directly with the worker, right? Directly with the rank and file journalist. And so journalists perceive their compulsive behaviors with Chartbeat as being the result of a failure of personal willpower, ironically, as opposed to being the result of managerial pressure, right? So metrics does all these things, but it does it by obfuscating the managerial role, right? And this is something that Chartbeat does. It kind of hides the managerial role by mediating this relationship between the management and the journalist. So I asked Kevin, another Gawker writer, if he checked Chartbeat on his phone. And he said he got kind of sheepish, he put his head down and he said, yeah, I'm not supposed to. And I was so struck by that. I said, you're not supposed to. And he said, no, we don't have to look at traffic that much, right? That's just me. Like I do it, but I'm not supposed to. So he actually felt guilty for looking at Chartbeat. And so in some ways, Chartbeat is a form of discipline that's very similar to the kind of classic scientific management time study, except in this case, Chartbeat creates the illusion that the journalists are holding the stopwatch themselves, right? That's the feeling that they have. So far, this may seem like a pretty straightforward story of managerial control, albeit managerial control that's kind of cleverly cloaked in a costume where it doesn't seem like control. But it isn't a simple story of managerial domination. And that's because I found that both inherently and by Chartbeat's kind of intentional design choices, the meaning of newsroom metrics was highly ambiguous. And Angèle writes about this beautifully in her book as well, right? That there's almost never a definitive, objectively correct answer to the question of whether a certain number of page views for your article is good or bad, right? Because there's just too many confounding factors that sort of muddy the waters, right? So stories have different subjects. Stories are published on different days and at different times. The news cycle that stories are competing with for attention is different every day at every moment. The amount of promotion that a story receives on social media, right? And then finally, that social media algorithms play a huge role in determining the visibility of a story, but these algorithms are controlled by tech companies that journalists have really no insight into. So it was very, very hard, just sort of by the nature of journalism and the media landscape right now to determine what metrics meant. And then Chartbeat, for its part, was hesitant to provide too much in the way of interpreting metrics because they were very worried about kind of being perceived as stepping on journalists' toes, right? Alienating this group of workers that they need to use their product to be a successful product. They need to be used in the newsroom quite heavily by rank and file journalists. But at the same time, they're very aware that this is a group of workers that might be kind of very anxious and alienated and pissed about Chartbeat. So they don't want to step on toes. They kind of need to perform deference to journalists. And one of the ways they do that is by not providing that much in the way of interpreting metrics. So there's this kind of enormous ambiguity and uncertainty about what metrics mean, right? Here's Felix, a Gawker media writer, saying, we're looking at these numbers all the time, but thinking about them totally irrationally, like looking at Chartbeat, what the fuck does that mean, right? And this was sort of this kind of thing came up a lot in my interviews, maybe not quite as colorfully with people at the Times, but that's the idea. And so what this ambiguity means is that interpretive labor is required to make sense of metrics, right? And what I found was that the ability to perform this interpretive labor, that is to decide what a particular metric means and what should be done about it editorially, and to have others in the newsroom accept your interpretation, that's become a hugely, hugely significant and contested form of power in the contemporary newsroom, right? And so there's this power struggles over who gets to make sense of metrics and what the metrics say. And these power struggles play out in different ways depending on the organization. So at the New York Times, it's a very hierarchical organizational structure. Editors kind of restricted access to metrics tools like Chartbeat. So At the time that I was doing this research, editors had access to Chartbeat and other tools, reporters did not, right? And so by kind of hoarding data in this way, editors were able to, in the words of Parker, a Times data analyst, he said they were able to manage the message of metrics a little bit. They feel that it's easy to misinterpret this stuff. Reporters are going to misinterpret metrics, and then they're going to use that misinterpretation as ammunition, right, to challenge their editors. You see already how metrics kind of become mobilized in these power struggles that are going on in the newsroom, in this case between editors and reporters, right? And this also became clear in an interview I did with an editor at the Times, longtime editor named Tim. He's complaining about reporters kind of seeing that their story made the most emailed list, which was at the time was kind of the only metric that Times reporters had access to because it was on the website. We all had access to it. And he complained to me that reporters would come to him and say, oh my gosh, look, my story's number one on the most emailed list. You should put it on the homepage. Well, no, that's not, we're not making judgments based on that. So he's sort of trying to fend off these appeals by reporters to give their stories more visibility because they made the most emailed list. And then, it becomes quickly obvious here when you look at Tim's quote that metrics threaten not only to displace writers and reporters, but also editors, right? Because they supply this sort of alternative yardstick that's separate from the editor's judgment for reporters to evaluate their own job performance and kind of advocate for their own strategic advantage. And so at Gawker, you saw a lot more of this because at Gawker, the top brass of the company made metrics very widely available to all staffers of the company. And what I saw was that writers would kind of carefully start to compile like a dossier or portfolio of their metrics when they were preparing to lobby their bosses for a raise or promotion. And especially I saw writers doing this who felt that they or perhaps the kinds of topics they wrote about were sort of systematically undervalued by Gawker's leadership. So Gawker's kind of executive leadership was mostly white and mostly male. And so there was, especially writers at the feminist site Jezebel, when they were kind of trying to get a raise or a promotion, they would say, I have to gather all this data to go to the managers because they don't necessarily care about what I do, right? So the metrics become this kind of arrow that I put in my quiver to take to them and convince these otherwise sort of skeptical managers that the work that I do has value. And so towards the end of my fieldwork at Gawker in 2014, I was seeing this kind of thing, and it was making me wonder if metrics were not as totalizing a form of labor domination and discipline as they had first appeared. So while metrics did sort of extract this increased productivity, they also provided this alternative evaluative framework for writers and reporters to understand their work and to understand their worth. And this framework, surprisingly to me, kind of countered typical discourses around knowledge work. So in the 1990s and 2000s, we had critical media scholars like Mark Dews and Angela McRobbie and Mark Banks, Gina Neff, who are lamenting the pervasiveness of what they call kind of enterprise discourse, right? Or the discourse of risk in creative and knowledge work. And according to enterprise discourse, workers should be really happy to accept poor pay and precarious career trajectories because, you're lucky to be here, right? You're doing what you love and you're going to succeed in this competitive, artistic or professional field. And so, don't complain, right? Be a go-getter, be enterprising, have this kind of individualistic sense of looking out for yourself. And up until 2015, this kind of enterprise discourse was indeed very common in the digital journalism industry. So in January 2015, the Washington Post publishes this article headlined, "Why Internet Journalists Don't Organize." And they argued that part of the reason was generational, right? Millennial journalists have this sort of neoliberal, individualistic idea of work, and they've built these personal brands that they feel that they can transfer from one company to another, right? And this Washington Post article wasn't a one-off. So around this very same time, Jonah Peretti, who is the founder and CEO of BuzzFeed, was asked by an interviewer about the possibility of his staff unionizing. And he said, oh, they don't feel that they need a union. It's not like they're working on a factory floor. Our writers see themselves as kind of aligned with management and they want to be top talent at a dynamic and flexible company, right? This is sort of classic enterprise discourse type of stuff. So Peretti says that I don't think that's a fit for us. And I don't think there'll be much interest in that. So not 4 months after this interview with Peretti and this article in the Washington Post, what happens? Gawker Media becomes the first digital media company to unionize, right? And it touches off this massive wave of unionization that has continued over the past 5 years now, where 60 plus digital newsrooms have unionized. And it's really hard to overstate how much this really bucked like the conventional wisdom about young digital journalists, right? This was just fascinating. And my field work had wrapped up by the time that Gawker made this move. But it was really interesting to me that Gawker, which was the digital media company arguably most associated with a metrics-driven culture, was also the first to sort of have the staff reject this enterprise discourse and to unionize. And I'm not saying at all that Gawker's kind of emphasis on metrics is the reason that Gawker staffers unionize. There are many reasons. It's a complex thing that was going on there. But there's a question that I raise at the end of the book and that I'll raise here before I wrap up, which is whether metrics kind of inadvertently help prompt a shift in mindset away from enterprise discourse in this type of workplace, right? So perhaps when there's kind of dashboards literally hanging over your head in your office that rank your traffic performance against your colleagues, that might do something to shake your faith in some of these enterprise values that have kind of been in the atmosphere, right? So metrics, especially when displayed on a giant flat screen monitor, this is from Gawker's headquarters, by the way, this picture. Metrics are both a symptom of, but also a symbol of journalists' structural precarity. And they make crystal clear journalists' economic value to the companies for which they work, right? And so zooming out from the case of journalism and into knowledge work more broadly, it's possible that by importing these kind of scientific management techniques of labor discipline into knowledge workplaces, metrics may kind of inadvertently make it harder for knowledge workers to ignore that what they do is work, even if it's creative, even if it's super prestigious, even if it feels autonomous and they feel really passionately about it and they feel happy to get to do it, it's still work, right? And so I end the book on a note of very cautious optimism about this heightened awareness, right? Especially insofar as it could lead to demands for greater dignity, stability, and equity in the workplace. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting about this with all of you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so I'm just moderating, but Jeff and Angèle, you guys are welcome to maybe do your thing now. And then when we get to the Q&A, by the way, if you start having questions, please do put them in the chat. I'll moderate the questions in the order they're received, and I'm taking notes on that. So please feel free. And in the meantime, Angèle and Jeff have a few things they'd like to say in conversation with Caitlin.
Great. So I think I'm going first. So first of all, thank you so much, Caitlin, for this great presentation, and more generally for writing this like such a cool, like amazing, really kind of. I mean, obviously, I'm interested in the topic, so there's that. But like, I just like I literally couldn't let it go. And I think that that some of this has to do with the way in which you write, which I think you're just so good at like bringing together like nuggets of fieldwork and like the kind of much more contextual kind of and broader picture kind of stuff. And as for everybody who is writing books is just like such a tough thing to do. So like, just like major congrats on that. I think also the focus on labor process theory is just really interesting. And I completely agree with you that it's something that that in the literature on like metrics and media is like probably a bit absent. So definitely along the lines of that, just really love the intervention. So I have like kind of three kind of things that I really kind of that grabbed me when I was reading the book, and the first one is really an existential question. So bear with me for a second, right? So okay, the existential question is the following, which like really kind of struck me when I was reading the book. Chartbeat is useless. It's like suddenly I had this realization, which like I think you just provide like all of that information in such a compelling way. Chartbeat is useless. So it's useless for journalists in a way, in the sense that they're not getting paid based on metrics, right? Like they're not. I mean, in the Gawker context, which is an exception, and as you show really well, so we're back and forth between individual bonuses and collective bonuses. So there was a bonus system for journalists to get paid depending on traffic targets, but like that was just a bonus, right? And like and anyway, it was discontinued after a while, etc. But most journalists never get paid based on metrics. They have all of these justifications for like, oh, it's good to have good metrics because perhaps like later on it will help me my career because I'll be more visible, etc. But concretely, and especially compared to another group that I'm studying right now, which is influencers. Now, influencers, they get paid based on metrics, right? The number of YouTube subscribers or Instagram followers directly shapes how much dollars they receive, how many dollars they receive at the end of the month. Not the case for journalists. Now, for newsrooms, same thing. Chartbeat is useless because, as you show really well, in fact, the kind of metrics that are really of interest for newsrooms are more either historical, like Quantcast and Omniture, right? That provides this more like kind of macro historical picture about how traffic is evolving over the months and over the years. They are less interested in the real-time data. And similarly for marketing departments, they don't really care about Chartbeat, right? So Chartbeat's the real-time thing is both completely addictive, completely grabbing, and yet at the end of the day doesn't measure anything relevant for anyone. And so I guess that, and somehow I just really realized that when I was reading your book, and and I think it's such an important point. And so my question for you is just so then why is it so important? Why is it so important in the life world of the journalist we studied, right? And obviously, I mean, you provide some answers, and I think that I very much agree with the answer you provide. So some of it has to do with the design choices of Chartbeat and the fact that they made it addictive and kind of turned it into a bit of a game with a whole broken dial thing, and all of the kind of dial moving and flickering and all of that kind of design and UX elements. Some of it has to do with major kind of field level, industry level characteristics. There is this kind of uncertainty about journalism and this marketization and financialization and kind of platform economy. And so, it's just kind of a symptom. You use that expression, which I think is metrics as a symptom of broader economic and technological changes. But at the end of the day, and especially seen from 10 years or whatever, 7 years later, I'm really curious about why do you think at the end of the day, journalists cared about the metrics? So I think that would be my first big question. I'm just going to walk through the next two questions, which are much shorter. The first one is, the second question is, and it builds on the first question. So if Chartbeat is basically useless, and if these kinds of metrics are basically useless, which is more or less what I'm thinking about right now, what is the long-term effect of metrics on journalistic careers? And I guess that's a question for you, having kind of followed these journalists over the past decade, what have they become? And I'm curious because, you mentioned in the book, Gia Tolentino, who then moved more in the writer direction and published a best-selling book. And I follow her on Instagram for what it's worth. And so I think of her almost as an influencer at this point. And so I'm wondering how were journalists able or not to capitalize on the metrics that they had during these early 2010s, right? Were they able, to put it differently, to kind of turn them into part of their own brand and kind of attention capital, so to speak, right? Or was it still very much a newsroom resource? And so just asking you, what's the kind of careers, how did the careers unfold over time? And finally, the last question, is about race and gender. And, again, having been in somewhat similar spaces in the early 2010s, I think that what was very striking is how little questions of race and gender were discussed most of the time, except exactly as you mentioned in your talks, the fact that, for example, female journalists, women journalists would often use metrics as a kind of weapon of the week, to use Porter's kind of expression, to kind of advocate for more, for higher pay, or for more responsibilities in the newsrooms. Of course, since that period, Me Too happened, right? And the kind of related thing, which is a shitty media men list, which was this kind of whisper network of all forms of harassment and abuse within the kind of New York media world, which Gawker especially is very much at the center of, and then Black Lives Matter happened. And so I'm just kind of curious about how do you see the questions of race and gender kind of shaping some of the findings that you have, and the fact that, like, to some extent, and again, that's like an open question for you, but like so many of these questions were kind of absent from the newsrooms we were studying at the time, and like, how do we grapple with it as ethnographers, but also what does that say about the journalists we were studying, and about the kind of like media discourse that that was emerging at that point. So I'll just stop here, but I think this is such an important book, and I think that like what's really fascinating about having looked at metrics from like a related but slightly different angle is to kind of see by reading your book like how much like it made me think about these questions that we both care about deeply in a different light, and kind of having this kind of like, wait a second, like, kind of realization. And so I just want to say that, this is just amazing, and I can't wait to assign it to my students and have many more discussions about metrics and media.
Thank you so much. Melissa, should I respond to Angela? Okay. Thank you so much, Angela. I felt the same way about your book. So it's like, this is a beautiful full circle moment. And you raised such great questions too. I was like feverishly writing notes as you were talking, so I didn't want to miss anything. For the first question, like Chartbeat useless. This is really an interesting question. So I think when we say Chartbeat is useless, like useless for whom, right? I think for management, it's not useless because of the ways that it facilitates this work speed up and work intensification that I think otherwise would have been vociferously resisted. And we've even written about this in our co-authored work, like if metrics are sort of pushed by management too obviously, without enough like sleight of hand of the tool doing the work of exerting the managerial pressure, journalists get really mad, right? So I think that from a management perspective, Chartbeat is useful in that way, right? Because it kind of gives the writers the stopwatch and says, go off, and it did extract this increased productivity around kind of writing. I write it in the book about grinding, like, which is something in game design, but it's sort of like also something that bloggers do. Like they're just constantly grinding out post after post because every post is going to get them kind of some incremental traffic. So that is certainly a result of seeing Chartbeat, and as is this kind of work of editorial optimization and visibility, right? And so I think from a managerial perspective, it's not useless. It's kind of quite useful, although you're absolutely right that the business side of these publications have no interest in real-time analytics whatsoever, like strategically and instrumentally, not as a tool of labor discipline. I think it is useful as a tool of labor discipline. I think it's not useful as a tool of kind of business development for the reasons that you said, right? They're more interested in historical analytics. Chartbeat even focuses on certain metrics that the advertisers don't care about. So there's this weird disconnection between the metrics that the newsroom is hooked on, and the metrics that the ad people are really, that these transactions actually get bought and sold ads based on metrics. And in fact, Chartbeat did try to put out an advertising tool. It was called Chartbeat Publishing for Ad Sales. And they were working on that quite intensively when I was there. And then they, in the language of tech startup speak, sunsetted that project because there wasn't a market for it. Ad sales folks were not interested in this. So it was very much like, this is an editorial product. So I think you're right that instrumentally speaking, it's not very useful, but managerially speaking, it was useful. But then I think there's also for journalists, like in addition to the fact that they get kind of hooked on these things in the ways that I talked about, I think there's a little bit of like an isomorphism, like a mimetic isomorphism thing going on, where Chartbeat kind of comes into newsrooms at this moment, like right at the end of the aughts, where journalism is financially in kind of complete crisis, and the scope of that crisis is becoming ever more clear, right? Like, oh, we're really in it. Like this is bad news. And then there's also a lot of anxiety in newsrooms about, well, how do we be digital, right? Like how do we, especially ones that are kind of transitioning like the Times from print to like a more digital first mode of production, like how do we be digital? And so metrics and Chartbeat become this thing that you need to have to sort of establish yourself as a legitimate digital operation. And it becomes like almost just, it says more about you if you don't have it, but it's unclear once you have it, like exactly what you're supposed to be doing with it. Like, as one of my respondents said at Gawker, like, what the fuck does it mean, right? So I think that part of it is that Chartbeat kind of comes in at this moment of kind of collective anxiety, where journalists are looking at other journalists at other organizations, seeing what they're doing, trying to figure out how to be a credibly legitimate digital news organization, and Chartbeat kind of slips itself in very effectively as a part of what that is. So I think it served a sort of legitimizing function as well. And then I think that there's also a piece of this that I think, when we think of Chartbeat and we think of tools that we associate with this sort of de-skilling, we think of these tools as sort of stripping workers of a feeling of control over their labor process. And certainly that's what the AOL way was. That's why people were so upset. But one of the things that's weird about Chartbeat, especially because they were very reticent to make recommendations, like they were not saying, put this story in this spot. Like, they pulled their punches deliberately, right? To kind of win over journalists. And I think instead of Chartbeat making journalists feel out of control, I think sometimes it was a little bit equivalent to like one of those, like, if your kid has one of those little cars and it has a steering wheel and the kid can sit, but you're pushing it from behind. And like, I came to feel like Chartbeat was sort of the pretend steering wheel. And then like Facebook was the adults behind, like actually pushing the car. But it's sort of this illusion that if I just tweak the content in this way, if I just post this to Twitter, with this headline instead of that headline, I can sort of give myself a better feeling of control over a media environment where the big players that ultimately determine my destiny are giant tech platforms who have these algorithms that are inscrutable to me and that I don't understand. So I think there was almost like a reassurance or a comfort that was also delivered by Chartbeat in that way. So that's my take on that question. Okay, then in terms of the kind of like long-term effects of metrics on journalistic careers, it's really interesting. So certainly there are a surprising number of folks from Gawker who are now at the New York Times. So this sort of dividing line that felt so strong. I mean, when I would go to the Times and do these interviews, in 2013, 2014, they would say like, oh God, we don't want to be Gawker. Like, Gawker was the nightmare scenario of like what the worst, right? And then cut to 5 years later and they're hiring everybody from Gawker. So I think that there was this sort of like these lines that seemed so strong became blurred. So that was part of it, but I don't know if that was connected to metrics explicitly, except that like, there was this isomorphism or mimicry where like at first Gawker and the New York Times used metrics extremely differently. And that was the kind of picture of time, that was the slice of time that I was doing my field work. As the years go on, they start to kind of converge a little bit more in terms of how they use metrics. So all news organizations start to, I think, adopt somewhat more standardized approaches to this stuff. And so it was suddenly thinkable that somebody from Gawker who had cut their teeth at Gawker could go and be successful at the New York Times. But the other way that I think is really fascinating that some of the former Gawker people have sort of leveraged metrics in a career in the way that you were asking about had to do with this company Defector, which is basically, long story short, but essentially Gawker, what's left of Gawker Media is now owned by a private equity firm called Great Hill Partners. And there was Gawker's sports and culture site, which was called Deadspin. And Deadspin's editorial team kind of had repeated clashes with the overlords of this private equity firm and the editorial executives that the private equity people had put in place, to the point where eventually the entire Deadspin staff of this sports website quits en masse. They all resigned together. And then what they did was they established a worker-owned media company called Defector, which is basically like Deadspin, but with a different name, and it's owned by the journalists. So they all kind of got together and started this thing together, and it's a subscription-based thing, right? And so if you hear Tom Lay, who's the editor of Defector, talk about this model and whether it's scalable or whether we could see this sort of worker ownership, he talks a lot about metrics and the fact that the size of Deadspin's audience and the fact that they felt like they could mobilize that audience was movable, would move with them, right? That was something that they could leverage and feel confident starting Defector. And so I think that's another really interesting, I mean, imagine if they had no access, right? Like imagine if they hadn't known at all how many people read their stories. Would they have felt like that confidence that they could start this, right? And that there was enough interest in this from the audience that they could sustain a subscription-based publication that was owned by the journalists collectively. I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure. I think that's another kind of surprising way that we see metrics become leverage for a really interesting model of media ownership. Yeah, in terms of race and gender, the question you raised, I think you kind of like said it better than, I mean, I think this study would look different now. Because, I mean, for a lot of reasons, but specifically vis-a-vis these questions that you talked about. But I also think in terms of the sort of lived experience of being a journalist of color online, being a female journalist online, like a lot of the things have unfortunately not really changed, right? So some of the respondents, women journalists and journalists of color, talked a lot to me about the kind of harassment and racist, I write about this in the book, like racist and misogynist comments and tweets and stuff online, sometimes coordinated harassment, right? And sometimes they would sort of use metrics almost as like a psychological reassurance, like, okay, these people are awful, but I have this audience. Like I know these people are behind me because I see the number. And I think those dynamics of like the sort of overwhelming harassment that journalists of color and women journalists face, like I don't think that that's changed that much, despite I think there is a lot more conversation about it now. I think there are efforts of varying levels of genuineness at different news organizations to try to change what newsrooms look like. But I think that some of these same dynamics, at least as they concern metrics, haven't changed that much. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Caitlin, for writing this book. And I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed your talk and where you ended in the talk as well. I thought that was interesting, the unionization piece. So my question is maybe related to Angel's in a very different way. What approach to studying digitization did you land upon in this book? And this is a very broad question, I know, so I'll tell you where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. So a very popular way to teach digital media and society classes or common tech classes is to introduce the framework of affordances, right? The emergent possibilities that people act upon through technology, and to think about affordances as this kind of sweet spot for our analysis between the determinism of technology apart from people and context and the wholly social construction of technology's meanings. And I think you have some of that framework here too, but I also think your analysis is focused much more on culture and emotions as they relate to technology design and use, more than affordances. So you discuss things like clean and dirty data, which you didn't get into in the talk, but is a really interesting part of the book. You talk about the containment and contamination of data. You talk about commensuration, you talk about work status and standards. And then you really don't shy away from determinism by investigating the effective and perceived determinism of Chartbeat for the journalists. So you talk about some things that we don't sometimes feel comfortable talking about maybe. And I really like that about the book, because you talk about the engineering of consent, and you talk about submission to the technology, and you talk about journalists doing things against their journalistic integrity, and you talk about obsession, and you talk about competition, and you talk about disenchantment with the technology, and then you talk about how much the technology is designed to counter these negative emotions. And throughout the book, the journalists seem to me very reactive. They don't, not that they're not agentic too, but they're very reactive. And in some cases, they're having a relationship to Chartbeat that has nothing to do with the organization, or has little to do with it. And so that's an interesting way to come at, I think, technological determinism and your analysis. And I know, like, it's a very bad thing to say that about someone's analysis, that it has, that it could be deterministic. So what's cool to me is the way you've kind of reworked that here. And maybe it's just in my mind, but that's something that I saw. And then I'm also thinking about like the Facebook leaks and how much the company and the user experience aims to control and hold attention of people when they're impressionable or vulnerable. And I really thought that was an interesting part of your analysis here. So I wonder what you think of my reaction more generally, and like what sort of approach you've developed to understanding digitization, because it's very compelling. So if you could sort of assess your approach here.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I teach a class called Digital Media and Society, and I do introduce the concept of affordances just in that way. And I hadn't really tied it together in terms of my own approach the way that you just did. Like it's really cool to see your sort of bird's eye view. I think I'm just too close to it. And maybe, it's interesting. I share your sense that tech determinism has become like a bad word or like a bad, and I agree with that, right? Like that's the reason I wanted to go into these organizations, is because I don't, I'm not like a technological determinist. But I also think, like you brought up the Facebook leaks, like I think that the discourse around that in our field has been interesting, because I think sometimes, and maybe this is like starting something I shouldn't be starting, but I think sometimes when we take a strongly anti-determinist position about some of these extremely powerful technology companies, we actually end up carrying water for the tech companies, right? And in a way that concerns me. So I do, I don't know. I mean, I don't think of myself as a tech determinist. And I sort of went in to this research saying, it was at a time when a lot of the kind of party line about analytics was extremely determinist. So it was like, you're going to bring in these metrics and suddenly journalists are going to write about Kim Kardashian, right? Like it was an almost direct, like there will be a causal situation. And I really wanted to do this research to kind of test out like that determinist line. And I think I found that the actual situation was much more complex than that. So I think I sort of saw myself as like fighting against this determinism. And that was like where I was in the first stage of the research. And then like, as I got deeper into this labor discipline stuff, I thought, okay, but like, this is a really powerful technology. I mean, I felt that it really was having strong effects, or at least like, certainly when I talked to journalists, particularly at Gawker, they reported extremely strong emotional effect, and often in real time, like they're IMing me as a story is, they perceive it to be tanking and they're really upset. So, I think that I'm kind of trying to balance like those two conflicting things, right? Like, and it goes into these broader questions about ethnographic methods, which is how much do you sort of take it at, take what your respondents are saying, and how much do you sort of try to distance yourself from that? And those are deeper questions. But one thing that I want to point out is that, I don't see like Chartbeat. I mean, I see everything that Chartbeat is as being the result of decisions made by people at that company, and decisions made in a particular kind of economic context where they need to make a viable business and get their B series round and all these, pressures on them. And the product, I think, the technology really reflects like their response to those pressures and their attempt to design a product that journalists would use. So I don't see it as tech determinism, because I don't see much agency like residing in the tech, none actually. I rather see this as being sort of Chartbeat is the product of a bunch of different kind of pressures that are bearing down on this startup, and their perception of what journalists are going to want from them, right? So I don't know if that's like a satisfying answer to your question, but certainly, I was kind of more interested in the big structural pressures that are pushing down on Chartbeat and also on the news organizations. And metrics were at a certain point, I kind of went through this crisis with myself where I thought, metrics really aren't causing any of these things. Like what's causing these things is these much bigger problems in the business model of commercial journalism. And so like, oh no, did I just spend all this time writing a book about metrics, and metrics don't matter? But I think, in the book, I make this analogy, the symptom analogy, and I say, there can be a symptom of a broader chronic condition in a patient. And the symptom is maybe not the ultimate cause of what the person is feeling, but a symptom can produce effects on a patient. And so that was sort of how I came to conceptualize metrics, right? They are a symbol of kind of hyper-commercialism in journalism, and they're a symptom of that. But then they also produce their own effects on journalists, and particularly on journalists' kind of lived experiences of their work.
Thank you. Thank you for, I'm now like tech determinism. How do I need to think about this? This is really thought-provoking. Thank you. Angèle or Jeff, do you want to weigh in with other stuff, or should we go to the question period? What do you guys have in mind?
Angèle, I have at most one more question, but I'm also fine to just open it up too. So how are we on time?
Let's perhaps open it up,
Yeah,
especially
sure.
because we have some questions in the chat, and perhaps
it.
people also have questions they want to ask live, and then we can circle back to your question. I mean, if you're
Let's
okay
do it.
with that.
That's perfect. Great. Okay, so I saw a few questions in the chat there, and Caitlin, I'm really just going to call on people. I just wanted to have a sense of order, but you had kind of a series of a little, mini side conversation between Susan, Keith, and Michael Lesk and Daphne about the export of the observations you're making to higher education, surprisingly. So I don't know, Daphne, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah.
As a kind of
Well,
ambassador?
first of all, Caitlin, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. I really appreciate it. But I couldn't but just immediately translate it to academic life. And your last comment right now about the symptom having effects rather than the way was just, I mean, I just changed the word journalists and say academics, and it sounded to me like we're in the same space of commercialization of academia and thinking of all the metrics we use now and how we reward people for citations and downloads and Twitter and whatever. So I'm just curious to see whether your next book is going to be about metrics in academia. And
Oh my
I
gosh.
don't know how it's going to help you for promotion, but still.
Yeah, that's a frightening prospect, writing talking about that. But no, I mean, I think that this is something that the parallel to academia is something that has been sort of like this little bird that floats around my mind and sometimes like pecks at me, but I sort of shoo it away because it's almost too close to home. But yeah, I mean, I think that, again, I am trying the book is very much about journalists and journalism, but I am trying to like draw these bigger parallels to other forms of knowledge work where workers sort of have this expectation, as I think academics, traditionally have, that we will have a fair amount of autonomy over the way we carry out our work and the way our work is organized, and certainly the way we are managed. And so, I think that, of course, there is academia.edu, right? And like, I don't know, I mean, those of us who are academics, I found them, first of all, impossible to unsubscribe from. I cannot figure out their system. But like, when you get that little email that's like, you've reached a new milestone, and it's like a little picture of a badge, like, you definitely want to click on that, right? Like, you see that we are, I think, or at least I am, susceptible to getting kind of pulled into some of the same dynamics. I think one of the differences is that our work takes forever. So, Gawker writers are turning out 5 to 7 posts a day. And so they're able to see, are people responding, and watch Chartbeat happen in real time, and that is very dynamic. And I think, citation counts and things like that, just in terms of the sort of user experience are very different, because, it's like, oh, that piece I published 3 years ago, like, got a new citation. It's not quite as magnetic, perhaps, but I think that a lot of the same dynamics, and the fact that, when there are these economic pressures, like when there is public skepticism or distrust, like all of these structural factors, I think, do push towards, and this is not this is Theodore Porter and other scholars who've done historical work, but they do push professions toward a more like metricized way of evaluating performance. And I think we're certainly seeing that in academia. In terms of whether there would be an analytics company that would be as successful as Chartbeat was in getting rank and file journalists to be hooked on it, I think that would be harder if there was going to be a Chartbeat for academics. I think they'd be a harder sell because, again, our work is slower. And also, I think there'd probably be they'd have to kind of perform even more deference to us in order to have there be take up for that. So I think there are a lot of parallels, in terms of like the broad scope of this, but it might look a little bit different on the ground. But certainly it's like a fascinating case, and one that I might explore if it weren't like a little too close to home for me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I take some other questions from the floor? You can feel free to unmute yourself and jump in at this stage if you'd like. Caitlin, you said you promised us, or you tantalized us during your presentation by saying you could get into a little more depth about the ethnographic practice. I would love to hear a little bit more about the kind of what sorts of rituals or routines you found yourself following, and how that more granular aspect of ethnography happened. And perhaps especially also, I'm curious about the difference between what it would look like doing that at the New York Times versus what it would look like doing it at Chartbeat.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, gosh, this was each of these three sites was so different in terms of the way access took place, in terms of kind of the way that people responded to me and my presence there. I think, the New York Times, like they did not want me. I mean, they did not really authorize me to be doing ethnographic observation there. So it was not like at Chartbeat where I was given this kind of spare desk and I parked myself right in the middle of their open plan office and could kind of like weasel my way into meetings and stuff. Like that was not going to happen for various reasons. I think the Times was going through like a particularly difficult moment at the time when I was trying to get access, and they felt a bit exposed already. So that was frustrating. Although interviews one-on-one were actually pretty easy to get there, like much more than I expected. People were very willing to talk. And then Gawker was a fascinating place because I kind of walked in and I had just been at Chartbeat for 6 months, and Chartbeat, was this very startup-y feel, like dogs wandering around. I mean, every cliche like you've ever heard about startups, like that was Chartbeat. Including like some kind of nice thing, like people, there was a lot of warmth there. Like there, I mean, I think a lot of people that worked there kind of genuinely did care about journalism. Like it didn't feel like cynical in the day to day, even though the product sort of came to me to seem that way. So, Chartbeat, there was a lot of like, they were over time, I would say they were letting me into more and more stuff, like as things progressed. And then Gawker, they let me in immediately. They said, yes, come do research, like whatever you want. They couldn't have cared. I mean, they just said, don't waste people's time. That was what they said. Like, don't take up too much of people's time because they got to grind out all their blog posts. And so that was like an easy initial access, but I would say that, in the kind of day to day, like I remember when I first got to edit like the editorial floor of Gawker for my first day of field work there, and I was so excited. And I thought it would be kind of like that had been a Chartbeat where I could sort of park myself and hear interesting side conversations and be pulled into meetings. And instead, like it was completely silent. Like nobody speaks out loud there because they're all, and then everyone, so people just have their giant headphones and they're typing on laptops. And then every once in a while you'd hear a peal of laughter because like a couple of them had like said something funny in Slack, or they didn't use Slack at the time. They used the so that was a kind of like a moment as an ethnographer where I thought, oh gosh, like this is not quite going to be like, unless I want to do my ethnography of like how often people get up to get a snack, like this is not going to be particularly illuminating. And so I had to pivot and sort of be like, okay, it seems like they're mostly on this program, a group chat program called Campfire, and I need to get in their group chats. And so I was able to convince a couple of editors of 2 of the sites to let me spend some days in the group chat. And that was where the ethnographic aspect of it like really started to come to light started to crackle for me, because you just get a sense of like how the quickness of the pace that they work at, like they're pitching things, they're throwing things back and forth. I mean, you could barely follow this thing, their conversations. And then they're also like, I would have the editor of one of these sites in particular be often IMing me over AOL Instant Messenger about like a back channel about what was going on in the Campfire, and then later send an email. And so they have all these modalities of digital communication, and those became the field site in a weird way. And then when I would go and do a couple of interviews with the business side people at Gawker, they were like in an open office talking to each other. Like it was a completely different vibe. So that was really interesting to see. And I think I never thought of myself as being like a digital ethnographer, but I did find that all of a sudden, because that was their mode of communication interaction, I had to kind of like do that on the fly. And so that was difficult in some ways, but in some ways it was also amazing because I felt like, I mean, I wasn't a participant in what they were doing, but I did feel like I got a feel for the real flow. Like I was in my living room and they were all in their living rooms all over Brooklyn, doing their work and talking to each other on Campfire. So they all were very distinct types of field sites to access to, but also to kind of like try to immerse myself in. And I've said this, like when I teach methods, like you think of the access negotiation as happening on day 1, but actually you're kind of having to like get that every day. Like you're having to get that trust and maintain that trust every day. And that happened differently at the different places. Yeah.
That's really fascinating to think about all these, like the multi-channel aspect of now doing ethnographic work. And so it's different temporalities at the same time. And anyway, I have 50 more questions about that, but I should, I'll go back to the chat before I ask, since I can, come and find you myself on campus. So there's a question from Julia Tacona. Julia, I'll go ahead and ask the question. Or do you want, you can jump in if you want, or ask directly. Hi.
Hi, I'm happy to ask.
Yeah,
Hey, Caitlin.
Hey.
I have to apologize too. I stepped out for a minute to get some lunch. So I'm sorry if you addressed this already in the earlier question and answer. If you did, please feel free to slap me on my Zoom wrist. So I was super interested in this very suggestive point you kind of ended on in your talk about the ways that being so enmeshed in this kind of culture of metrics and being, confronted with their economic value on a day-to-day basis, maybe actually promoting some kind of resistance, not against the metrics themselves, but against this kind of broader culture that maybe the metrics kind of emerged from, or that they represent in some kind of ways, and might be actually promoting this like pendulum swing towards unionization, right? I think that's absolutely fascinating, the ways that they cannot be resisting the master's tools, but they can be resisting the master's like ideologies or something. And so I'd love to just hear you talk more about that. And if it's, if you think this is something that we might see across industries where we also see an intensification of metrics. Of course, I'm interested in gig work and in places like that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. I feel like that's one of the questions I raise in the book. That's sort of one of the most interesting ones to me as well. But it also feels like one I want to talk about with people and get feedback on, because it did kind of the bulk of it happen after my fieldwork had wrapped up. And so I've just, but I feel like I had gotten to know Gawker really well by that point. And so I just was thinking like, it can't be a coincidence that, that it was Gawker that was the first. And there were a couple of sort of interesting wrinkles that emerged. Like one of them was that Gawker's staff had these debates about how they were voting, like with their names attached on the unionization drive publicly on Gawker. And like those posts did a lot of traffic, right? So that was like this really interesting thing where, management was pretty like accepting of it. And I had like, and as they had been accepting of staffers at Gawker raising like a lot of, I think, what traditional media companies would consider like the dirty laundry of the company very publicly. Because, and I think part of it was like, those posts do a lot of traffic. Like that was, so it was this sort of weird thing. But I also, I mean, that was another thing that was super interesting to me, was that, as you said in your question, put it so well, they weren't resisting metrics. Like they did resist one metrics dashboard while I was there, which I can talk about if people are interested. But by and large, like they did not at all have a problem with the presence of metrics in their work. And so when they were negotiating and when they were debating to form the union, like metrics did not come up very much. At the Washington Post, actually, I think this was in 2015 as well, when they were renegotiating, one of the things that they demanded was more access to metrics, because they said, because they were like, this stuff is being used and we don't understand how it's evaluated. Like, how are you going to compare? It was these questions of commensuration. How are you going to compare somebody who covers Hillary Clinton to somebody who's covering, like a DC suburb? I mean, it's just like, how do you commensurate these things? And yet you are, right? And so we want in on that, basically. So I think that, I don't know. I mean, I guess like I'm curious to hear more reactions. I'm curious to talk about it with people. I think that like there has to be a relationship between sort of seeing your work that you've always been told is like a labor of love and, not about the money. And all of a sudden you see this most crystal clear representation that like, it is in fact about the money. And you bring value, right? That is quantifiable to this organization. And so then this enterprise stuff is like a harder pill to swallow. And I think it sort of puts that in your face front and center in a way that I think I think it could contribute to this kind of like mindset shift in other forms of work. And certainly I'm interested in the kind of, high income, like spectrum of the gig workers you've studied. If you've seen, how much do they have these enterprise discourses that they mobilize, and how much are they really starting to push back against that? Yeah.
Caitlin, you have a quick question in the chat about whether Defector uses Chartbeat.
Such a great question. So I don't know the answer to that, but I actually am right now doing an IRB application to try to study Defector because I'm totally like obsessed and fascinated with Defector. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I will try to find out and get back to you, assuming that I get IRB approval. I think to do interviews there. My guess would be that I was going to say at first, like, I don't think they would because they're subscriber, totally subscriber based, but actually I'm going to change that and say, I bet that they do. I bet they have Chartbeat, even though, you know, they're not an advertising based company. Oh, sorry. Jess says, remind the group what Defector is. Defector is the worker owned media company that was formed by some ex-Gawker staffers who left altogether. They resigned en masse when they had clashes with the private equity firm that bought remnants of Gawker Media. Yeah. So there's very different ownership model, obviously. And the question was whether that company uses Chartbeat, and I will stay tuned for the sequel to this project.
And then Angèle, I don't know if you want to jump in, but you had asked about the parallels with other creative workers in creative industries, which I also am really curious about.
Yeah, I mean, I just said it's so interesting, and, you know, just like kind of riffing and thinking, I keep thinking about the book, etc. I think that journalists are such an interesting case because they are knowledge workers and creative workers, but they also are embedded within organizations, right? I mean, not unlike academics, I guess, but I guess like the question is like, so what about then creative and knowledge workers who are already much more in this kind of entrepreneurial thing, right? Where like, so I'm thinking artists, writers, etc., who like only have their own forces to rely on in a way. I mean, of course, that's not true because distribution, publishing houses, like museums and all the kind of organizational infrastructure under it. But I'm just like, yeah, really curious. I mean, I guess it's another way of saying like, what are you thinking? And, you know, I realize this is a tough question to put you on the spot, and I know you're thinking about it. So like, I would just love to hear your thoughts about what are you thinking of studying next, or like, how do you think, like, are some of the differences and similarities in how different kinds of knowledge workers and creative workers are dealing with metrics, right?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there is, so I'm going to shout out a couple of other scholars actually. So there is some really interesting work on these questions in other kind of creative industries. So there's a scholar named Anne-Marie Navarre-Gill who studies TV creative professionals, and she did this fascinating study at Netflix and how they were actually kind of hoarding metrics about viewership, not only from the public, but actually from the creators of the shows in a way that kind of was very reminiscent of the times, except that Netflix's whole thing, their whole brand, right, is like a data-driven approach to creating televisions and movies. So that was really interesting. And then there's someone named Robert Prey who does some of this stuff on Spotify and you know, streaming platforms for music and musicians, and how how musicians sort of interpret metrics. I mean, I think that, and then I'll also shout out your book because you have work on freelancers, which is another huge question. Like, freelancers are a growing portion of, so you know, a lot of journalists actually are not embedded in organizations at all, and you know, the questions of how they're paid, which your book addresses in depth, but also like, how do they, you know, mobilize metrics when they're trying to advocate to get an assignment and things like that? You know, that's a question I would like to even see more work on, because I think it's, yes, I can share those references, although, wait, I'm just going to write the names of the scholars in the chat. Or if someone else knows these scholars, they could also do that. But I don't want to lose.
You can give it to me and I can put it on our Twitter feed, even if that's, if you don't want
Okay,
to do it
yeah,
right
I
now.
mean, I'm just typing now, but yeah.
Hard to like.
And Angèle's book, read Angèle's book. Okay, so so those are the scholars I was thinking of. But yeah, so yes, like I'm certainly interested in these questions of how kind of like more independent cultural workers think about this. I don't think that's the direction that I want to go in at this moment for future stuff. I don't know. I'm still thinking about that. And like you and I have talked about this and my questions about this. I think that right now, like I am interested in this question of like different ownership structures or different funding structures in journalistic organizations and how those, may manifest in different types of practices around metrics and labor discipline or not, right? Which would be super fascinating. So there is this kind of growing move towards some like worker-owned media co-ops and stuff like that. I think I'm very, very curious as to whether they use metrics. So that's like more where I see it going. But there is like, I think there's a lot to explore here. And eventually, like I would love to, for instance, like write a paper with scholars like Robert or Anne-Marie and see, like, can we actually make comparisons across these different cultural industries or not? Like, are the dynamics super different?
That's great. I was going to ask you what you're thinking about coming down the pike. And so now we have a sense of it. I think it's so critical when we're thinking about culture and how culture is industrialized to try to see what the parallels are, and also where the points of inflection are, and whether metrics is like some sort of umbrella structure that we now have to incorporate into all of our studies in cultural industries, or whether actually we have to really do the kind of more local, granular, case by case, which is almost always how we end up thinking, right?
It's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also a new book that just came out about metrics in fields of cultural production by Brooke Duffy and David Nieberg and Thomas Powell, and I think that will be based on what I know of their work, like a kind of really nice synthetic look at some of this stuff. But I think there are also real specificities. Certainly I'm more familiar with the ones in journalism, but in terms of how this data kind of reads like interpretively to people within each field.
Sorry, I was just putting the names in the chat as you were. I couldn't remember the
I forget what the book is called, but it just came out like last week, so it shouldn't be hard to find.
Well, I'm going to now take a minute and wrap up if there are no additional questions. So I want to, now take this time to thank you, Caitlin. Thank you so much for helping us think through some of these really critical ideas, I think so relevant to the work that we're all doing. I want to thank, because I neglected to properly do this a moment ago, is to thank Holly Avella, who's our not only coordinator of this amazing event and helped make it happen, but also a PhD candidate here at Sky and coordinator of these workshops and designer of our new website. So please do take a look at that. And then, of course, I want to thank Angèle and Jeff for your really relevant and provocative insights here to kind of help us also think through some of these critical issues from your close perspectives. And finally, thanks to all of you. Thanks for being here. I did put the link to purchase Caitlin's book in the chat, and there's a discount code which is there. We'll put that on Twitter as well. I put also our website and our Twitter feed there too, so you can access that. And hope to see you again, all of you, really soon at our upcoming event, which is in November with Deborah Lupton. We will be sending out information about that really soon to all of you. So make sure you're on our mailing list for that. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you so much. Thanks, all of you. Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon talking metrics. That's like what I want to do on a Friday afternoon, but I'm happy that others of you are willing to do that as well. And
always.
I know. Yeah, Angèle, I know you are.
And thank you, Melissa.
And thank you, Melissa. Yes,
for organizing this
being our MC,
managing this conversation.
Yeah, thank you all, and happy weekend, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.